You're listening to Indie Live Radio, and this is the Monday morning Yes Group Spotlight show, in which we highlight a recent event organised by one of the many Yes groups around Scotland. This week's show features an online event organised by Grassroots Oban, focusing on the current debate around list voting for the Holyrood elections. The Grassroots Oban team arranged for a panel of speakers to each give their view on the subject, and then there's a very lively question and answer session afterwards. Once again, thank you to the Grassroots Oban group for agreeing to Indie Live Radio broadcasting your event. Here it is.
Thanks to everybody for coming. Thanks particularly for the four panelists, John Curtice, David Thompson, Lorna Slater and Keith Brown. The way that this evening is going to work is, first of all, John Curtice will give us an explanation as to how the polling system works. Following that, he will be sharing the screen with you. Following that, each of the speakers will then get 5 minutes to talk. After that, we'll have questions and answers. Unfortunately, I can't let you ask the questions yourselves because there are getting on for 200 people supposed to be joining this meeting, and it just would be a nightmare. So I'll read them out for you. John, over to you. Could you unmute yourself, please?
Sure. Thank you very much, Ruth, and it's a pleasure to be doing this. It always takes me about 30 seconds to remind myself exactly how to share the screen, which is one of those glories of the Zoom system, but hopefully this is now coming up, and if we persuade it to go on to slideshow, then we should be there. So what I'm simply going to do at the beginning, and this is probably already going to divide the audience into two, not necessarily between those who think that we should be having separate list parties and those who don't, but between those who reckon and indeed do understand the Holyrood electoral system and its intricacies, for which, to be honest, if you've now got 5 minutes to go away and get a coffee if you haven't got one already, and for everybody else for whom perhaps some of these intricacies have passed them by. It's really just to try to give you a background so that everybody is up to speed when we come to debating some of the issues at stake this evening. So, first of all, just to remind you, under the Scottish Parliament electoral system, every voter has 2 votes. One is for a constituency MSP, so it might be for Argyll and Bute, for example, and one is for a list constituency, which might, for example, be the Highlands and Islands region, of which Argyll and the Bute are part. Voters are at liberty either to vote for the same parties on both votes, or to vote for different parties. And it's the fact that they can vote for different parties that at least opens up the possibility of parties running only as list parties, which of course is what the Greens have primarily, although not wholly, have done in the past. 73 of the seats at Holyrood are elected by single member plurality, or otherwise known as first past the post, and 56 are elected via a system of list proportional representation, i.e. you just vote for a party list, and these are allocated separately in each of 8 separate regions, so 7 in each of them. And the crucial bit you'll have to understand is this, and I will go through some of the arithmetic with you. The list seats, the 56 list seats, or the 8 in each of the individual regions, are allocated so that the total number of constituency seats and list seats, one by each party in a region, is as proportional as possible, given the formula, to the share of list votes that each party gets, not the constituency vote, the list vote, given the outcome in the constituencies. So if a party cannot lose any of the constituencies that it's got, and it might end up with more than its proportionate share, in which case it keeps them, but the additional 7 list seats are simply allocated to the party so that the seats that each party has is roughly proportional to their share of the list vote. And that does mean that at the end of the day, it is the list vote, not the constituency vote, which is intended to be the crucial vote. Now, you may be asking, well, how does this work? So let me just take you through an example. And here is the Highlands and Islands region back in 2016. And I've excluded the parties that didn't do well enough to get a seat, otherwise life would be too complicated. And the top row simply indicates the number of list votes that each party won across the Highlands and Islands region. And yes, the SNP was well ahead with about 37–38% of the vote. The Conservatives came second, the Liberal Democrats came third, and Labour came fourth, and the Greens came fifth. And then what you can also see on the next row are the number of constituencies that each party won. And basically the SNP won all of the seats, bar the two Northern Ireland seats of Orkney and Shetland. Those two went to the Democrats, as they usually do. The remainder of the seats went to the SNP. So the SNP start with 6 seats, and the Liberal Democrats, although they were only third in terms of list votes, start off with 2 seats. The way we then allocate the remaining 7 list seats is at each stage, we look at the figures we've got. And we first of all, we divide each party's vote by the number of seats that it has got so far, plus 1. Why plus 1? Because otherwise you'll be trying to do, if a party hasn't got any list seats, any constituency seats at all, you'll be dividing by 0, and the answer to that is infinity. So we divide every party's vote by the number of seats plus 1. So the SNP have got 6 seats. So we are there dividing the 81,600 list votes by 7. Similarly for the Democrats, except we're dividing by 3. So when you look at row 3, you can see the average vote per seat that this calculation produces. And basically what we do is that we give to whichever party at each stage of the count has the highest average vote, we give them the next seat. So the Conservatives at the moment are the party who are most hard done by, so they are allocated the first list seat. That pushes their average vote down just over 22,000. That, as a result, means that Labour's average vote is slightly higher than the Conservative average vote, so they get the second list seat. The Conservatives then get both the third and the fourth list seat. If we then just turn over the page, now by this stage we've allocated 3 seats to the Conservatives, 1 to the Democrats. Sorry, 1 to Labour, and Liberal Democrats and the SNP have the 2 and 6 seats they originally had. It's the Greens who now are entitled to the 5th seat. But at this point, even though the SNP already have 6 seats, when we get to the, excuse me, to the 6th seat, their average vote is highest, so they pick up the 7th seat, and then the Labour Party are the ones who managed to pick up the last seat. So that's basically how it operates. So you can therefore see that if a party does relatively well in the constituencies, it may not get any list seats at all. In the Highlands and Islands, that is the fate that befalls the Democrats. They get a lot of very beneficial representation after the fact that 2 very small Northern Ireland constituencies and Northern Ireland constituencies are both a Liberal Democrat. So actually the 9,074 people who voted for Democrats, it could be argued, and this is part of what we're going to be talking about this evening, wasted their vote and might have been, well, have voted, for example, if they wanted to vote against the SNP or the Conservatives or the Labour Party on the list, and they might have helped one of them to get a seat instead of the SNP picking up the 6th seat in the constituency. The system is, however, only roughly proportional. And basically, what tends to be true is that whichever party, if a party is well ahead of everybody else, and in this instance, the SNP was well ahead with nearly 40% of the vote, then you will typically find, even if you've got to allocate that party some list seats, that they end up with a higher proportion of seats than they do votes. Basically, there are two reasons for this. One is that that arithmetical formula means that the first seat costs you much more than later votes. And secondly, if you don't get 6% of the vote or so, you may well not get a seat at all. And as you can see, nearly 7% of the vote in Highlands and Islands were wasted. And these two things basically end up benefiting the largest party. So if you're well ahead, you don't necessarily need to get 50% of the vote to get half of the seats under this system. But to come closer to home to what we're going to talk about this evening, and at this point I will stop for now. The reason why this issue has arose to the independence movement, though it has to be said, this is by no means a new debate. The argument that SNP voters should be encouraged to vote for somebody else on the list vote, it was alive in 2016 when there were those who were arguing that voters should vote for either the Greens or for Rise. And if we go back indeed to the days when the Labour Party, now perhaps the dim and distant past, when the Labour Party was dominating Holyrood elections, it was indeed suggested that perhaps the Cooperative Party, which of course is allied to Labour, should put up its own list, and that Labour voters should be encouraged to vote for the Cooperative Party, because otherwise the Labour Party was finding itself on occasion not picking up list votes. And certainly the result in the Glasgow region, which is what I'm showing you here, is an illustration of what can happen because voters have seemingly wasted their votes. So this is summarising the result in the Glasgow region. The SNP won all 9 seats in Glasgow in constituency seats in 2016. And as a result, their average vote is only 11,110 per seat. And basically, all the other seats go to either the Conservatives, to Labour, or to the Greens. But as you can see, the Greens actually weren't that far off getting enough votes to pick up another list seat. And indeed, if you do the calculation, it's a little bit complicated, so trust me, that if just over 6,000 of the 111,000 people that voted for the SNP on the list vote had voted instead for the Greens, then the Greens would have picked up the last seat rather than the Conservatives. And to that extent, at least, this is the kind of example that is used by some people to argue as to why perhaps people should not necessarily be encouraged to vote for the SNP at the list vote. Now, I'm not casting any judgment on that at this point in time, but that's just to illustrate for you the reason why we have been having and are having this debate within the nationalist movement at the moment.
Thank you, John. I hope everybody now understands the polling system if you didn't before. We'll now move on to the guest speakers. If you could give us 5 minutes, please, for each of you, starting with David Thompson. Could you unmute yourself, please, David?
Well, good evening, everybody. I'm Dave Thompson. I'm the interim leader of the Alliance for Independence. The concept of AFI was, it's not new in the sense that for a couple of years, people have been considering maxing the yes, as we call it. But our unique selling point, I think, is the fact that we wish to unite all the smaller independence parties under one umbrella. So we're not just another party standing against the ISP and the SSP and Solidarity and the Greens. We want all to come together. That's what we're after. We're after unity. And if we get that unity and combine our votes and negotiate between those parties winnable places across all the regions in Scotland, we will wipe the floor with the unionists. We'll get up to 24 seats or even more with unity. So I've got to stress that. And it's important that we get all the smaller parties to come together if at all possible. But even if we just get 2 or 3 of the smaller parties together, those small parties that probably won't win any seats on their own will be virtually guaranteed a seat if they join with AFI. And that's just because of the way the system works. If you pool your votes together, you can win a lot. And our proposal is first vote SNP, make sure the SNP win all the constituencies or nearly all the constituencies, and current polling shows they could win 70 or more. And for the AFI, with the smaller parties, to win up to 24 seats, giving somewhere in the region of 90 plus pro-independence MSPs in Holyrood. So first vote SNP, second regional vote AFI. Now some of you might be wondering about recent news that you saw that the Electoral Commission had not accepted our application to register as a political party which can stand in elections. And that's quite true. 90% of the objections were because we used the phrase, for instance, Vice Convener Finance, instead of calling the Vice Convener Finance Treasurer, which is what the Electoral Commission require. So all we need to do is tweak our constitution slightly to say our Vice Convener Finance is our Treasurer for EC purposes, and that will be hunky-dory. So we sit down with them in about a week, we'll go through all these little technical details and we'll sort it. They equally didn't like our name. They said our name would be misleading because any voter would think that the Alliance for Independence covered all of the independence supporting parties, even though those parties might actually be in the ballot paper as well, such as the SNP. So they didn't like our name and said it was misleading. And unfortunately, we don't have 25,000 to pick up on a judicial review to challenge them because we don't agree with them. So what we'll do is we'll have to just change the name and get a name that's suitable that they don't think is misleading. We'll reapply in a couple of weeks, and a few weeks later, we'll hopefully get the formal recognition. But we are a political party. It's just that you need to be registered with the EC to actually stand in elections. And that is our intention. Our unique selling point, as I've said, is that we want to get on board smaller parties, umbrella parties we call them, so we can pool our resources and knock out a lot of unionists and fill the Scottish Parliament with a super majority. And to do that as well, what we need to do is turn next year's independence election, next year's election into the independence election. At the heart of our manifesto will be Scottish independence. And we are asking all the other parties, the SNP in particular, and this is a challenge to the SNP and to others, put independence the top priority in your manifesto. Make next year's election the independence election. And by doing that, we will have the bonus of motivating a whole lot of people out there to get out to vote when they know that it is crucial for independence. We'll therefore increase turnout. And if we increase turnout to 2015 levels or thereby, then SNP will do an awful lot better, and so will AFI with the smaller parties on the regional lists. I thought Professor Curtice presented a very fair analysis of the system. And what I would say to you is this: in seats where the SNP got no list MSPs the last time, in the likes of Glasgow, they would need to get an extra maybe 30,000+ votes from unionists. They would have to convert no voters to yes to the SNP to have any chance of getting a seat. Whereas for a fraction of those votes, moving from the SNP, yes, people who are committed to independence, moving from the SNP to the AFI, we can get lots of votes. All we need is one person in 8 who voted SNP the last time, right? One person in 8 who voted SNP on the regional list to vote for AFI and our united parties, and we will get 8 seats. So one person in 8 switches to us on the regional list, we get 8 seats. Now these are broad figures, I accept that, but if we get a quarter of the folk who voted SNP last time round in the regional list, we'll get 16 seats. And so it goes on. And if you look at the south of Scotland, for instance, as an example, people say you shouldn't stand there because the SNP got 3 list seats in the south of Scotland. The one other one they got was in the Highlands and Islands that was illustrated. Nothing at all in the other 6 regions. But these 3 list seats that the SNP got are very, very vulnerable because 4 of the SNP's target seats for constituencies are in the south of Scotland. So if the SNP win those 4 seats and they run in percentage from 1% swing required for the SNP to win up to just over 3% for the SNP to win the constituency, and the polls are showing they're way above that already. So if the SNP win these constituencies, they get none of those list seats. But
David, I'm going to have to ask you to finish shortly because you've already had nearly 2 extra minutes.
Oh, sorry, my clock rang earlier and it didn't start recording to tell me. I'm very sorry about that. Well, I'll just finish on that point that the votes that we need to get lots of extra MSPs are quite small compared to the number of votes that the SNP would need to get any extra seats at all. And with the polls the way they are, it looks like they're going to get a majority in their own right in the constituencies anyway. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, David. Next to speak is Lorna Slater from the Greens, please.
There we go. Well done. Thank you. Thanks very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me along. Loving all the indie chat. So it's an exciting time. It's going to be an exciting election. It's definitely going to be the independence election. I think we can all be pretty confident that the constitutional issue will be core there. So the Scottish Greens have had MSPs in the Scottish Parliament ever since there has been a Scottish Parliament. The party is over 30 years old. We've got loads of experience. There's Green councillors all over Scotland, and even having a small number of Greens can make a significant impact on the politics. We currently have 6 fantastic Green MSPs, 2 in Lothian, 1 in Glasgow, 1 in Highlands and Islands, 1 in Mid-Scotland and Fife, and 1 in west of Scotland. So we've got a good, hard-working set of Green MSPs. We're polling really well for the next Holyrood election. We're polling around 10 right now. And that's before we've even started our campaign, which we're just starting to kick off now. So that's good. Many of you probably know that the Green Party Green Party of Scottish Greens were part of the Green Movement, which is a worldwide movement based on green values. So that peace, sustainability, equality, and radical local democracy. So for us, Scottish independence isn't independence for independence sake, it's independence for a reason, because we think we can build a better Scotland, a fairer Scotland, a more democratic Scotland, a greener Scotland. We can have a manufacturing revolution. There's a lot of good reasons for Indie, and we want to see those implemented. We've had some really strong green wins in the Scottish Parliament. For example, we have every year negotiated and supported the SNP budget. So that's been an interesting process where other parties have just thrown their dummy out the pram and said, if we can't get what we want, we're not going to participate. We consider ourselves a constructive opposition. We're willing to negotiate and compromise and find consensus and work together. And as a result, most people in Scotland pay less income tax than they do down in England, for example. And the richest few, they pay a little bit more. But we're Scotland. We have different values, and we think that that's really important. And I think it's really nice that we've had a minority government in Scotland for the last term, because it means that we've been able to have that level of influence. As we've seen disastrously down in Westminster, when you have a majority government, they can do whatever they want for 5 years with no accountability. When you're a minority government, you have to have more grown-up politics, more negotiation, more consensus building, more hearing different voices. So we think that that's something super powerful about the Scottish Parliament. We've also had a big impact in other areas of the budget, particularly around local council funding. We've kept libraries open in Murray, we've kept sports centres open, we've kept school crossing borders, we've kept the Stirling Museum and Gallery open. There's a lot of things that have come from having Scottish Green MSPs. So yeah, we're super proud of that. I would never, ever suggest trying to game the system. Vote with your conscience. We're a democracy, vote what's right. Vote for what you believe in. Vote for what you want. It isn't easy to game a D'Hondt system, and I wouldn't recommend it. Genuinely, go out and vote for what you want. I would never discourage another party from standing. Democracy demands choice. Democracy demands we give the voters as much choice as possible. Having said that, it is not easy to throw together a political party on short notice. With 30 years experience, we'll probably win 10, maybe a few more MSPs next year. If you look, for example, at the Brexit Party down in England, well, all over the UK really, even with Aaron Banks's millions, they couldn't win any seats. It's much harder than you think it is to kick off a party and actually win seats. There's also the fact that lots of people who might vote yes can't stand the SNP for whatever reason. For example, former Labour voters that maybe are drifting toward yes. We know that 40% of Labour Party members are now yes. They might be much more inclined to vote for the Greens. That's certainly the demographic that we're going to be going after, is former Labour voters who share our values, our kind of more socialist values. So that's something that we're going to be working on for sure. I think that's pretty much all I've got to say is, yeah, vote with your conscience and keep up the good work with the Yes movement.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Next to speak is Keith Brown here. Keith, have you arrived? No,
what I'll do is I'll just really stick to the topic that we were asked to discuss rather than go into why people should vote, as I believe they should vote SNP for both votes. First of all, apart from what we see in being ruled from governments that we don't elect from Westminster for many years, and apart from what we see from the current Tory government stealing the powers of the devolved Scottish Parliament, it is still true that we live in a democracy when it comes to Scottish parliamentary elections. And it follows from that, in my view, that anybody has got the right to stand, to be a candidate, and to vote for whichever party they want. I simply believe, as Deputy Leader of the SNP, the best thing for independence is to have both votes SNP and to have the strongest possible representation of SNP MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. And to back that up, I would suggest that if you think about what Boris Johnson would most not like to see come next May, I think it would be a thumping SNP vote in the Scottish Parliament. I think it's also true to say that the polls look very good just now, as a previous speaker has mentioned, but they looked even better 5 years ago, and they didn't transpire the way that many of us hoped. If you take, for example, the Highland constituency, the Highland region, the SNP, it's said to be leakage, the number of votes less that you get for the second vote or the list vote than you do for the constituency vote. We lost around 7%, which meant that instead of 2 SNP MPs, we didn't get any list SNP MSPs. And if we were to have that back, we could have had an additional SNP MSP, which would have meant the majority in the Scottish Parliament would be one short, the 65 that's required for a majority. So that does show the effect of, if you do choose, and you have the right to choose, to vote for somebody other than the SNP on the subsequent vote, on the list vote. There are, I think, good reasons why I think it was very important that people vote both votes SNP if they want to have that push forward for independence. First of all, it's crucial. You cannot get an overall majority in the Parliament, something that's very hard to achieve in any event, but it's impossible to achieve without winning list seats as well. You have to win list seats in order to do that. It's also true to say that if we have a number of parties, and actually I agree with Lorna, it's very difficult for a new party to come through and reach what John showed was the kind of threshold of around 6-7% to get a seat. If you did get that and a number of different smaller parties represented, I think it would simply be a case of the Conservatives trying to divide and rule. And also there would be differences inevitably between the parties on which they would divide. I think there is no problem at all in giving the assurance that for the SNP, the central piece of the election is going to be independence. The First Minister has already said that, and it's quite clear that our intention is to get the strongest possible vote and to move forward to a referendum as soon as possible thereafter. And the best way to do that is to have the backing of very strong representation in the Scottish Parliament. I think it would also be true that the next election is an absolutely crucial election. We've seen what's happened to the country through Brexit. We've seen what's happened as recently as yesterday with powers in the Scottish Parliament being taken away and taken to Westminster. And for that reason, also because of the way that the respective governments have coped with the COVID crisis, and also because of Brexit, which I think continues to be a huge issue for many new people coming across to independence, it's absolutely imperative that we strike out as an independent country, and this is the election in which to do that. I very much hope to have this referendum by now. I think COVID has put the block on that for this current year. There are big questions as to the continuing effect of COVID in future months. But I do think that it's vitally important, if we agree, and I think everyone that's spoken before, perhaps with the exception of John, will believe this is an exceptional and absolutely critical election, and also the best opportunity that Scotland has had to achieve its independence. I know Dave Thompson well. He and I were on committees together. We are friends. I am as committed to independence as anybody. I joined 6 years before the Green Party were even formed, and I joined because I supported independence. I see Peter Bell's on the call. One thing I would say is, it was said earlier on, Lorna said that didn't want independence for its own sake. Well, I want it for all the other reasons, but I also want it for its own sake as well. I think it's a proper condition of a functioning democracy to be independent and to be sovereign. I also believe we should be members of the EU and share sovereignty in relation to that. So if this is the most crucial election, if independence is central to this election, I believe the best thing we can do is have the strongest possible representation, hopefully an overall majority, notwithstanding how difficult that is to achieve. And the best way to do that is to cast both votes for the SNP.
Thank you. Right. Thanks very much, Keith, for that. We're now going back to John so that he can speak further about the more intricate problems of this debate.
Some of this has already been referred to, but let me just show you a few numbers that might be thought relevant to debate. So as I think both Dave and Keith have both indicated, the SNP are currently well ahead in the opinion polls, on average running at about 54% of the vote. In the constituency vote, rather lower on the list vote, 46%, not least of the reasons for that, of course, is that the Greens register on the list vote, whereas they don't register on the constituency vote because they don't always fight the constituencies. So all the parties will have a bit of a drop-off, but it's certainly true that the SNP seem to have rather more drop-off, although I would always say the polls do find it more difficult to get the list vote right, because almost undoubtedly some people, depending on the wording of the question, think that they're being asked their second preference because they've not necessarily had my recent lecture on how the Holyrood system actually works. But in any event, crucial point is that the SNP are well ahead of where they were in 2016, when of course they didn't get an overall majority. So what might that point to? I think we're probably going to agree about the facts. I think we're now going to disagree about the interpretation. So if you take the current polls and you make a fairly simple assumption that the increase in SNP support is happens more or less uniformly across Scotland, then taking the average of 4 most recent polls, you're looking at the SNP having something like 71 out of 129 seats. And that indeed, actually, contrary to what Keith just said, actually on this projection, the SNP will have an overall majority simply by the constituency seats that they won, because they would probably win so many of them. And indeed, actually, the number of list seats that the party would have would be even fewer than it had back in 2016. Now, I think, if I understand the argument correctly, Dave will argue, well, that's the reason why the SNP voters should split their vote, because it's clear in most list regions it isn't going to add to the tally of list MSPs supporting the nationalist cause. I think conversely, however, Keith may want to argue that there isn't any need to split the vote because the SNP are going to win the election anyway, and you will have to decide which of those two arguments you think matter. Two other points, however. One is, well, what are the prospects for a pro-independence separate list party that's only standing on the list? Now, this was a somewhat controversial question that was commissioned by a somewhat controversial source, I think even within the nationalist movement, i.e. the Wings Over Scotland, but it's perfectly honest polling done by Panelbase, which asked people whether or not they would be willing to vote for a pro-independence list-only party that it was suggested might be led by Alex Salmond. And as you can see, about 26% of all voters said that either they definitely or were more likely than not to do so, or about 40% of those people who had voted for the SNP in last December's Westminster election. And if you think that that 40% of SNP voters would actually vote for a separate list party, then certainly that translates into around 18% of the vote, which is roughly in line with what Dave, I think, is claiming is the kind of performance at best his alliance could achieve. So I certainly, we can argue about how solid that polling evidence is, but if you believe it, then the translation into seats certainly does follow. But here's the rub. And at this point, I'm going to make myself unpopular with Lorna, but will probably make a point that Keith would want to make. As I indicated earlier, there was an argument in 2016, and some people were arguing that people should vote tactically for the Greens on the list vote. Now, of course, not everybody who voted SNP in the constituencies and for the Greens on the list vote was voting tactically, because, of course, the converse to the fact that some people might vote for the Greens on the list vote, even though they're primarily SNP supporters, is that some people are going to vote for the SNP in the constituency contest because they don't have a Green candidate to vote for. But one of the things I did way back when, 5 years ago, when I was analysed in the 2016 election, was to try to use the election results to come up with an estimate of how many people did vote tactically for the Greens on the list vote. And this was done by basically looking at how, particularly what happened where the Greens were standing in the constituencies. And B, then, what might have been the consequences of that for the outcome in seats. And this is the end point of that calculation. So basically what I estimated was that probably about 2% of the list vote that the Greens got, and they got, what, nearly 8% of the vote, but that probably were voters who were voting tactically. Now, certainly, and this is the point that Lorna would wish you to take on board, is that if indeed we knock 2% off the Green vote everywhere, then indeed the number of seats that they would get falls from 6 down to 2, back to the levels they fell to previous elections. And 2 of those seats would indeed go to Unionists, but equally, the other 2 seats would have gone to the SNP, and as a result, the SNP would have had a majority. So at this point, you do have to decide which is more important, perhaps maximising the chances of there being a nationalist majority, but at the same time, potentially risking the prospect of an SNP majority. Now, for there to be any prospect of risking SNP majority, it already follows from what I've said, that the SNP position of the polls needs to be weaker than it is now, but maybe it will be. But that essentially is the rub, that you can play this tactical game, but as it were, you do have to make the right judgment call. And, if you are the leader or the deputy leader of the SNP, yes, I am sure that the support of the Greens during this minority parliament has been well and truly welcome. But inevitably, like any other group of politicians, the SNP would have much preferred to have an overall majority on their own, because they have on occasions lost votes and have had to make decisions that they perhaps would otherwise prefer not to make. So that's, in the end, you know, the judgment call that you have to make as to, you know, what you think is more important, et cetera, et cetera. But that's certainly, if you make the wrong call about the list vote, either because actually if you'd stuck with the party that you thought was going to do really well, it actually would have got a list vote, or indeed in transferring, you don't necessarily actually help the other party to get a seat because maybe it's not doing well enough, then you will not be any better off. So just be aware that's the, as it were, the casino game that the Hollywood electoral system, for good or ill, does invite voters to play.
Thank you very much, John. Right, we're now going to move to our question and answer session. Now, I said to you that all questions would be read out by myself rather than going to the individual questioners, just because logistically, I think going to be easier for us. However, I am going to make one exception. We have with us tonight Davy Hooks, who is heavily involved with the Independence List Party ISP. He wanted to be on speaking, one of the speakers, but he was too late, and I didn't want to alter things around. So I don't mind if Davy, if you'd like to unmute yourself, if you ask your questions, but you have asked 4 questions, 1 for each panel member. So I would ask you to keep them very brief, please, because we have lots of other people wanting to get their questions out. So Davy Hooks of the ISP.
Thank you very much for allowing me to be part of it and to ask questions. I'll be as brief as I can. John, you said on news programmes and in position papers in 2016 that voting for the SNP on the list was in many cases, and as in most regions, a wasted vote. Have you changed your mind on that, given what we've discussed this evening about the potential for them to gain even more seats and possibly only one list seat? Keith, this is kind of off topic, but it's on topic. Given the vote in the House of Commons yesterday, and indeed the UK's withdrawal bill, which superseded the Scottish Parliament's withdrawal bill after the fact, do you still believe the UK government will grant a Section 30 order? And if they did that, would they play fair? And is it still SNP policy that there cannot be a referendum without one? For Dave Thompson, the Electoral Commission already rejected your application on the grounds that voters might be confused and think you were an alliance of the yes supporting parties, as you mentioned. And none of the existing yes parties have said that they wish to join you. So isn't your best strategy at this point to max the yes, actually to throw your support behind ISP? Lorna, the Greens are predicted to gain list seats as the polls stand, mainly off the back of independence voters. Will you push for an independence referendum without a Section 30 order? And if not, why should pro-independence voters vote Green over ISP? And that's me.
Thanks very much. Davy, maybe we could go to John first.
Okay, let me be brief, because I think, with all due respect, that wasn't quite the position I was adopting in 2016. Indeed, yes, of course, I did write a paper that pointed out that indeed, you know, some people might think, as I have just said this evening, that voting for the SNP on the list was a wasted vote. But I then also pointed out, with examples, the potential dilemma that could face and how such a calculation could misfire, and that actually, given the position of the SNP in the polls at that point in time, it wasn't entirely clear which would end up being the better course of action. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks very much. Keith, could you answer your question, please?
Unmute him. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so the question was, yes, is the SNP's position that we should seek a Section 30? The reason for that is because what happens after a yes vote, it's much easier to get international recognition to move quickly forward to becoming an independent country if it's on the agreed basis with the rest of the UK. So that is our position. Do I think it's going to happen? Yes, I absolutely do think it's going to happen. If you look at the way things have changed, first of all, I mean, I remember saying 10, 18 months ago that the longer that the UK government said no, the more that independent support would grow. People don't like to be told no in that way. It's also true if you look at people like Andy McKeever, former Tory spin doctor, Peter Duncan, former Tory MP, a number of Tories down south, and even Ruth Davidson have all conceded that if the SNP win a majority, there should be a referendum. I absolutely believe they will have to give a referendum because if you look at the way Boris Johnson's campaigning just now up in Scotland, they're actively campaigning for a referendum right now for their no position. So yes, I do believe that's the case.
But they've already
Beyond
said
that, I've said
get a majority, even if SNP
I didn't interrupt you, Dave, when you were asking me a question. I also said previously at an independence meeting that I believe that self-determination is something that cannot be stopped by somebody else. It's an inalienable right. So if it was to be endlessly refused, then of course Scotland has to decide on what else it can do in order to make sure that happens. Self-determination is something which is your right to do, and it can't be denied by somebody else by definition. So I think, yes, it's the SNP's position we should seek a Section 30 agreement, and yes, I believe a Section 30 agreement will come forward. I do agree with your point, and that does not mean that the Westminster government will play fair. We've seen now they're trying to change the franchise, and they'll try and change all sorts of other things. It's up to us to make sure that we do that, and the best way to do that, in my view, is to have a strong SNP government in Edinburgh fighting their corner.
Thanks very much, Keith. Do you want to come back on that again, David?
Yeah,
very briefly, if you do.
Just briefly, so you do concede that at some point, if the Tories do continue to say no to Section 30 order, that at some point the SNP are going to have to look at an alternative route?
First of all, I don't think that's what's going to happen. That's the point I'm making. I think a Section 30 order will happen. So I think that's what should be the case. The point I would make is that if you're a party and a movement that stands for self-determination, you cannot accept that somebody else can veto that. But what we do in that eventuality would certainly come way beyond the first port of call, the first preference, the best option, the gold standard, which is to achieve an agreed referendum in the first place.
Thank you. David, would you like to answer your question, please?
That's great. Thanks very much, Ruth. Hi, David. A couple of things, I think, in reply to your questions. First of all, we're all on the same side. We're on Scotland's side, and we're all, I think, committed to win independence for Scotland. And we may have differences of opinion on certain things, but at the end of the day, we all need to pull together. The big difference between AFI and ISP is that you're a traditional party, and you'll be developing a whole lot of policies. We won't. We have one policy, independence. And if we can unite the smaller parties like ISP, Solidarity, SSP and the Greens under the one umbrella, each party will get allocated winnable positions across Scotland, be negotiated. You'll be able to follow all your own policy positions, just as you have. I would also agree it's difficult to start a new small party, a traditional new small party. What we're suggesting is that we combine our forces, and individual parties can still follow all their own policies as long as they back independence. Alliance candidates will be local champions. They'll be selected in each region, and our regional members will select them, and they will put forward their own local manifesto, independence, top and centre, and then probably local issues, championing local issues, taking them down to Holyrood. A bit like Margaret MacDonald did when she stood as an independent after she left the SNP. She backed Lothian, she had specialist subjects that she worked hard on, and she had, the interest of Lothian at heart. Together, united, we can do this. Separated, we're going to not be able to do it. And I would suggest to yourself, David, and the ISP, that you come and have a serious chat with us and talk this through. And I think you'll see it will be to your benefit and to the benefit of AFI to get together, and also other small parties. And between us, we can really drive up to 24 unionists, Tories, Labour and Liberals out of the Scottish Parliament and fill those seats with independents supporting MSPs from across a wide range of views and parties.
Thank you, David. Do you want to come back on that one, David?
Yeah, just a couple of quick brief ones. So because of the electoral system that we stand under, David, I don't mean this in a nasty way, but whether you like it or not, you are a traditional party that you have to stand under your banner and with your name, whatever that ends up being. So what you're asking is for other parties to come under whatever name you end up being called, and asking voters to vote for someone whose policies they don't know, who they might end up with an independent. They might end up with someone who is, I think you mentioned in your article in the National, you might end up with someone who's going to vote for to roll back abortion rights, etc. People won't know who they're voting for. The reason that the ISP have policies is so that people know where that party stands, where we stand on specific issues, and you know what our values are. You're asking people to vote for your party, because it would be a party, but you're then not allowing the parties themselves to determine who their candidates are going to be. So, as I say, I think all of the Greens, ISP, SSP have already said that they're not going to be involved in that. If you were an umbrella organisation and not standing as a party, then that would be, in my view, a much better way of doing things. But obviously,
that is exactly what we are, and you need to read our constitution. I'll send you a copy after this this discussion.
But you still want people to stand as...
We are an umbrella organisation, and small parties can join us, yes groups can join us, and individuals can join us. In each region, our members, including the small parties that join, will choose candidates. They'll be ranked 1, 2, 3, 4. The top 3 obviously have the most chance of winning. They will go out and campaign. There will be manifestos put out. The public will know exactly what the folk they're voting for stand for. And the great beauty of it, David, is we're going to have 24 people with a whole range of views right across the political spectrum. So people are going to have somebody that backs their view, and within AFI, no matter what their view is, because it's going to be so wide-ranging. And isn't it an attractive proposition for you as a new small party? You said to me, come and join you. But what if I don't like the policies that you are putting forward? I couldn't join you because I wouldn't agree with your policies, and that's the flaw.
Well, that's exactly the issue that I've raised with yourself, is that you're asking people to vote for you when the candidates that you put forward may not actually believe in policies that they believe in. So you could have someone who is ISP who's getting a green candidate.
You're putting words in my mouth, and they're words which are just not correct. I'm sorry, David.
Right, and we're going to have to move on to the next one.
For us,
Appreciate the response, Dave. Thank you.
It'll be very clear, David, just what our individual candidates and our small party candidates stand for in every region. And the point is this: if we don't come together, we will fail. If we come together, we shall succeed.
Thank you very much. Lorna, could you answer your question, please?
Absolutely, no problem. So the question asked for me was two-parter. It was the same question that was put to Keith about the Section 30. It is also Green Party policy to go for Section 30. I agree with Keith completely. It is becoming less and less tenable for the Tory party to hold out on that one. And even Tory pundits themselves are starting to say, we can't hold out on this, we can't hold out on this. I think our strategy there is to push the pro-independence polling to 60%. Some of the polls are already 55, 57. Our job as the Yes movement is to step out what an independent Scotland looks like. What are we doing with the currency? What are we going to do with our economy? How are we going to implement fair taxation? And how are we going to manage our budget? How are we going to deal with all the issues that people were worried about last time? How do we rejoin the EU? How do we look after people's pensions? How do we answer the worries people have? We can set out that plan, and we can win over those voters to yes. And that unstoppable movement, it is absolutely that unstoppable. And I wouldn't pin anything on what Boris Johnson said. He was supposed to be dead in a ditch like a year since. So I wouldn't believe anything that liar says myself. And the second part of the question was about why people should vote for the Greens over the ISP. I think I covered that pretty comprehensively. We've had parliamentarians in every version of the Scottish Parliament. We're experienced. We have a track record of delivering for the people of Scotland. We know what we're doing. We've got more than 6,000 members campaigning all over the country. We can actually win seats, and we can be really effective in government.
Thank you very much, Lorna. Now we'll move on now to to the questions that have been submitted. First one from Ian, is that Machian? The question reads, my understanding is that imperial studies based on other more popular concepts of proportionality show that the D'Hondt system is one of the least proportional among the proportional representation methods, and that the system favours large parties and coalitions over scattered small parties. Therefore, would it not be better for the independence movement if the SNP and the Greens fought the next election on the understanding that they will form a pro-independence coalition after the election? Now then, this is obviously going to be answered by quite a few of you, and what I suggest we do is that all four speakers unmute yourselves, and without jumping in on top of each other, I'm sure you can work this out amicably between yourselves. Would you like to answer it? I think we'll probably go for Keith first, with Lorna second.
I think in response to the first question, probably John's best place to give the response about the electoral system. All I can say is that the electoral system is the one that we have to deal with. There are flaws with it, as there are with most systems. I do remember at SNP conference back in about 2003-04, we had a vote to elect a new leader. It was John Swinney at the time. And just before we had that vote, we had a vote on STV for local council elections. So there's 700 plus people in the hall. Only one hand went up against STV for local elections, and it was mine. So I was roundly defeated because I didn't think making the constituency link with councillors was a good idea. However, to me, it's literally academic just now. This is a system that we currently have. So in terms of moving forward to independence, this is a system we have to move with, make sure that we benefit from and achieve independence. So we just take that's where we are just now. And D'Hondt's not the worst system in the world by any means. It's certainly an improvement on the Westminster use of first past the post, where if you want to know what a wasted vote is, look at some of the constituencies which racked up massive majorities but very low turnouts. So that's the system we have. And I'm not sure what the second question was. If I've missed it out, we'll come back to that after the other speakers if you like.
Well, you can probably, I'll probably say what Keith was wanting to say anyway. These SNP are polling for a majority government, so the question of going into coalition is unlikely to come into question. The SNP are unlikely to need us. If there was a question of another minority government, I suspect that we would continue on the same basis that we were now, with the Greens supporting some SNP legislation, like stuff around independence, maybe supporting the budget based on negotiations, and disagreeing on other things. I can't see there being a coalition or any particular need for one.
Maybe I can come in here, Ruth, if that's all right. I think if you look at the D'Hondt system, it's not perfect. I don't think there's any perfect electoral system anywhere in the world, and there's no perfect proportional system either. But it's the system we've got. And I think it was Lorna mentioned earlier on that she wouldn't encourage anybody to game the system. What we're proposing to do isn't gaming the system, it's using a legitimate legal system that is there to be used. And actually, it's basically tactical voting. What we're suggesting is tactical voting. And if you look at the Conservative vote, if you go back to 2011, the Tories got 12.4% of the vote in 2011. By 2016, they had increased that to 22.9%, nearly double. And you know why that happened? That was Ruth Davidson's her one-trick pony trick. Getting the unionists, promoting the union, the whole issue about Scottish independence, to get as many unionists as possible to vote for the Tories. So did she game the system by doubling the vote, by saying to unionists, vote tactically for me? And if you've ever been in a Lib Dem constituency, like I fought many times in the Highlands, you used to always see these little leaflets about the two-horse race the Lib Dems would put out. Vote Lib Dem, don't vote Labour or Tory, because only the Lib Dems can keep the SNP out here. Was that gaming the system? That was encouraging tactical voting. So the system lends itself to tactical voting. And what we're trying to do is say to current SNP voters and other yes voters who don't vote SNP with their second vote, they just vote for the constituency, vote for the alliance, vote for folk who come together and make sure your vote actually returns independence supporting MSPs on the regional lists. Because what's the most important thing here? The most important thing here is independence. We've got to get our independence next May. If we don't get our independence next May, it doesn't matter what policies you want to promote. It doesn't matter what policies you've got in your manifesto. The Scottish Parliament will be destroyed, and Scotland it'll be turned in the very best to a wee parish council and will not be able to do anything. We are for independence, and therefore all this debate about policy this and policy that, it's not central. Independence is central, and that's what we need to unite to deliver.
Shall I just briefly answer the technical question, Ruth? So D'Hondt is a system of allocating seats to parties. It's also a system you can use to allocate seats to places if you're trying to do a boundary review. It is true that it is a system of allocation that is somewhat more favourable to larger parties than to smaller parties. And indeed, it's because of that characteristic that we do not, for example, we're not going to use the D'Hondt system to allocate. We've not been using the system to allocate seats to places, either for the European Parliament now, we're no party of, but now indeed parliamentary constituencies for Westminster. These are allocated by a different system called Saint-Lagu, which is treats small parties and bigger parties equally. But the disproportionality of the Holyrood system doesn't primarily arise out of the formula for allocating seats. It arises out of two features. One is that the proportion of seats that are list seats and therefore allocated by proportional representation is well less than 50%. And secondly, they are allocated separately within each of 8 regions. And for example, it is perfectly possible. It's something that, for example, the Labour Liberal Democrat majority in the 2003-7 Parliament rested entirely on constituencies that between them those two parties won that were in excess of their proportional allocation, i.e. what would have happened if you'd allocated all the seats in a region by the D'Hondt formula. So in other words, the lack of proportional, in fact, you've only got 7 seats in a region. It creates a de facto threshold of about 6%. If you aren't going to get 6% of the vote or something close to it, you ain't going to get a seat. And it does therefore make it easier for larger parties. So yes, it's partly D'Hondt, but it's much more the fact that it's the proportion of list seats and the fact that those list seats are allocated separately within 8 separate regions that creates the disproportionality in the system, and is the reason why, for example, in 2011, the SNP got an overall majority at Holyrood, even though they only got 45% of the vote. And this is a system that, despite the preferences of some of those in favour of PR, this is a system that's capable of producing an overall majority at Holyrood for a party that's got considerably less than 50% of the vote.
Thank you. Right, another question here we have from Peter Bell. The new parties claim to be all and only about independence. If by some chance any of their candidates were to be elected, what would they actually do in practical terms to help bring about the restoration of Scotland's independence?
Do you want us in any order, or?
No, you can, so long as you're all polite to each other.
Okay, well, what we'll do is we'll have in our manifesto an absolute commitment to independence as the thing we're about. At our conference later this year, we're going to debate the route map to independence, which will look at all the various routes, not just Section 30, because there are other options. Now, let's presume in next year's election, the polls, as they are just now, continue and actually improve. And let's presume that SNP get about 70 constituencies, or in the high 60s. And let's presume that people wisely use their second regional list vote and vote for AFI, and we get over 20 seats. You've got a situation there where you have a supermajority of MSPs in the Parliament, but let's also presume that in both the constituencies and the list, there is over 50% of the Scottish public voting for independent supporting parties. Now that would look very much to me as a possible mandate, not for a referendum, but maybe even for independence itself. And I think we need to get into the debate about how we turn next year's Scottish election into a real Scottish independence election, and maybe think very seriously about putting a proposition forward on that basis. We need to have serious talk and serious discussion. The other parties need to do the same. And if we were to go into that with that kind of commitment and get more than 50% of the vote and about 60-odd% of the MSPs, we could open negotiations for independence almost immediately. That's the kind of thing we'll be looking at our conference. We haven't made a decision yet, but that's the sort of thing we are looking at, making next year's election a truly independence election.
Anybody else want to comment on that?
Well, let me enter where angels fear to tread. I thought that was an interesting answer, because Dave was beginning to answer the question as to what difference would it make having 90 pro-independence MSPs as opposed to 70, because it might be argued that 70 is enough. This is the way that you might, however, want to think about this, and which is that at the end of the day, if indeed you want to maximize your chances of persuading the UK government that it is honor bound to deliver a referendum, then I think my view would be, for what it's worth, and this is simply tactical advice, it's not reflecting anyway any personal views. My tactical advice would be that what you have to say this side of an election is simply that you want a Section 30 order. In exactly the same way that this side of an election, the unionist side, are only going to say, we don't think there should be a referendum. Because if either of you compromise from that position, you are potentially undermining your post-election negotiating position. Because if at the end of the day, you're going to maximize your moral leverage over the UK government, you basically have to be able to say, look, we've achieved exactly what we did in 2011. You gave us a referendum then, why can't we have one now? And by the way, that's what the public have voted for. Et simile for 2015. That's not to deny that actually, in exactly the same way as it is perfectly clear that those on the unionist side are thinking about what they will do if indeed the SNP wins an overall majority, but in the meantime they will be doing their damnedest to avoid. That doesn't mean to say you shouldn't be thinking about and having a clear plan about what you would do if the UK government were to deny you a majority. But I think if you want to maximize your moral leverage at election, your message has to be, this is a vote for a referendum. Because if you say anything about, well, but if we can't get that, then we will have this, then the UK government can say, well, that's fine, you go off and do this then. Because you didn't say to the public, what you want is a referendum, full stop.
Can I maybe come back to Professor Curtice there in relation to that? That's all very, very laudable, and it's based on a presumption. And that is a presumption that you're dealing with honourable people and that you can trust them. And I think it's been made very clear in recent times, even in the last couple of days, they are not moral people and you can't trust them. So how can you negotiate with folk like that? And asking them to do something, they'll just tell you to go away and behave yourselves. And they'll push through legislation, undemocratic legislation, because I believe the Tory government in London got just over 40% of the vote, even though that gave them a majority of 80. So I think maybe they gamed the UK system to win that election. So should we even give them any credibility whatsoever? We have got to be very clear, and my point, I think, Professor Curtice, was that if we debate and say, we're not just looking for a referendum, I mean, what would your view be if we went into that election next year saying, clearly in our manifestos, all the independent supporting parties, if we get more than 50% of the vote, and a supermajority of MSPs, that is actually an international mandate to declare and open negotiations on independence itself.
Well, of course, I've been around long enough, Dave, to know that that used to be the SNP's position. And some of us did feel after 2011 that perhaps the SNP regretted the fact that it's changed its position to be in favour of holding a referendum. I guess I would make 2 points. One would be is that insofar as one of the lines of attack of the Unionists is that the SNP keep on flip-flopping on this issue, and of course their standard line of attack is they said it was, you know, a once in a generation opportunity, and now they say we want another referendum. Well, equally, you might then be enabling to add to that line of attack. Oh well, first of all they said they want a referendum, and now they're saying that an election is sufficient. And of course, you do have to bear in mind the brutal truth is, even if you take the view that you've just taken, you will still have to negotiate independence with the UK government. You might have to drag them kicking and screaming to the negotiating table, but eventually you will have to talk to them. But then thinking beyond, you're right, I don't necessarily assume that the UK government will necessarily grant you a referendum. And I did say you then have to think about what you might do next. But this is a conversation to be had in private meetings like this, not something to be said in public, all right? This is where you have to be a little artful. And I would certainly, let me just throw something out here, and Keith may or may not wish to respond. I think he's wise he won't, which is that I could well conceive that if indeed, there is indeed an SNP majority in next year's election, and if, let's say, the opinion polls continue to show a majority in favour of independence, albeit relatively narrow as it is, by the time we come to the 2024 election, the SNP might say, well, you're not willing to accept the mandate from Holyrood, so our position now is, if we win a majority of Westminster seats, then we will regard that as a mandate for independence, and we will comport ourselves at Westminster accordingly. And then also think that although the Holyrood, no Holyrood election ever gives you leverage vis-a-vis a UK government, a Westminster election potentially does. There is still a non-trivial probability that the next UK general election will produce a hung parliament, and a hung parliament in which it may well be that the SNP has the balance of power. Now, in those circumstances, if the scenario I've painted out we have played, then you know the problem that any UK government will face is it's incapable of being formed because the SNP will gum up the Westminster works. Now, and it's because, however, that kind of leverage does potentially exist. In other words, if indeed you do get a majority next year, any sensible unionist government is going to have to think about, well, if we say no, what will the other side do? All right. And if the other side has any sense, it will have been thinking about, well, what do we do if the other side no? And so both of you are going to have to think about how the other side would react. But these are all things I would suggest for you to think about and mull over this side of next May, but things you certainly should be mulling over in order to work out how you may indeed maximize the leverage that we'll have if indeed you do have the good fortune of having a nationalist majority in the next parliament.
Yeah, we do an awful lot of mulling, definitely. We mull over lots of things like that, I can assure you. It worries me a lot when you start talking about the 2024 UK general election, because I do not believe that the Scottish Parliament will exist in its present form by that time. They will strip us of powers, they will neuter us, they will put us in our place, and because of the doctrine of parliamentary sovereignty, there's very little we can do. But what we have to do is look at other options for challenging them, and we really do need to focus in on next year's election. And surely if we make it clear, all of the independent supporting parties, and people know what they're voting for very, very clearly, no sort of fudges or anything, very clear, then it is totally unanswerable in an international context.
Yeah, but the logic of your position, the logic of your position, David, is that you think Boris Johnson's going to say no, period. So if that's the logic of your position, what difference does it make having 90 MSPs who are in favour of independence as opposed to 70? If you think Boris is going to say no, he's going to say no.
I wonder if I can come in just to say that, first of all, apologies to Dave Hooks. I'm not sure I understand his question about whether I prefer to have an SNP majority of one in terms of MSPs or an Indie majority. I'm not sure. In any event, I think, as Dave said, we're not in the game anymore of waiting to try and see if we can get the balance of power at Westminster and hanging on for year after year for that. I don't think that's going to work, and I'm not prepared to wait for that. However, I do think it's important that we, as Dave says, next year is the year. Now, the question then is, the SNP will have its central commitment for an independence referendum. In terms of timing of that referendum, there's two things. One, that we don't know what COVID's going to be. We just don't know. And just as we're struggling now to campaign because you can't go around people's doors, think about trying to have a campaign for an independence referendum when you can't do that and who that would advantage. But separately, if the COVID situation is substantially better or resolved by that stage, then if you look how quickly the Labour government was able to move to a referendum after 1997, you can see how quickly a referendum could take place. It was undoubtedly the case, of course it is, that other things have to come into play and be considered if you were to get a completely thrown UK government. I know, I see in the chat box, many people don't believe that. I fundamentally disagree with you. I think they will collapse like a house of cards. I don't see that for wishful thinking. Just observe their behaviour over months, the behaviour now, the way they're acting. If you look at how extreme the positions have now become, this is usually a precursor to having to abandon a position. How extreme. One of the positions is your Willie Rennie or Jackson Carroll, no referendum, never under any circumstances, no matter whatever vote you win. These things are not sustainable arguments. They're being used less and less. I believe they believe they're going to have a referendum. So I believe that's what would have to happen. But of course you can't accept that in perpetuity. But on the fundamental point, we should be aiming to say that's our central aim, is to have an independence referendum. There can be no doubt on the part of either the people of Scotland or a UK government. That is what the mandate is about. And we move as quickly as possible to a referendum thereafter. I know people will disagree with that, but that's the view that I would take in relation to it. And I think the Section 30 is not just about an agreed referendum for the sake of it. It's because it's extremely important to how quickly we move from an independence vote to being established, for example, at the UN and in the international community. So I genuinely believe, I'm not trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes, I think this is the best route. I think it's going to happen as well, although it does require us to win that election in the first place. And it is not easy to win a majority. Lots of people saying in the chat bar about the SNP currently on 54%. Well, we were on 60% at different parts of the last election. In 2011, when Dave and I stood, I became the 65th SNP MSP to be elected at that election, the one that tipped the balance. But 2 months before that election, Labour were 10 to 15 points ahead of us. 2 months in the March of that year, we won an outright majority. So nothing is taken for granted. This is all still there to be won, but I do believe we're closer than we've ever been.
Thank you.
Can I come in there, because the boys have had a lot of chance to chat. I think the main focus really needs to be on winning that referendum when we get it. I agree, it's inevitable, it will come. There's no going back from the unionist failing position where they are. Young people between the ages of 16 and 24, 85% in favor of independence. And as time goes on, it's only, the chances of the unionists winning this time are getting worse and worse. They know it. We know it. Their best chance is actually to have the referendum as soon as they can. If they have 4 more years of stripping the parliament of powers and refusing a referendum, the main thing which I think we need to repeatedly say is we don't mind them campaigning for the union. They can go and do that if they feel that they can say anything good about it, because I don't think they can. The reason they're saying no to a referendum is because they have nothing good to say about the union. Hit them with that. They have nothing good. That union isn't giving us anything. They've got nothing good to say. Their whole campaign is that they're going to deny us a vote. Well, they can't win that one either, because that's not democratic. It's not how democracy works. Governments must govern by consent. And consent, as everybody knows, is something that you have to check in with periodically to make sure that you still have the consent of the people. No legitimate democratic government can hold out against that. So what we need to do is drive that support for independence amongst the people of Scotland. We need to make sure that the people of Scotland really believe this. What we don't want to do is end up in the post-Brexit situation of a 52-48 split. That would get us independence, but it would be a shit time after independence. We'd have, a divided country. We wouldn't have people unified into this vision of what a better Scotland can be. Let's work on that. When the referendum comes, people will know what they're voting for. The young people will be excited about it. We'll get it, and we'll get that chance. But keep your eye on what's really important, which is actually getting that independence, not just pissing off Westminster.
Thank you, Lorna. Right, next question comes from Pat Lee. Bear with me, this is quite a long one to read out. Many commentators debate the safety net of the regional list vote for SNP, with support for SNP in recent polling showing an increase to 54% of the electorate, if predicted on the Yes movement joining the campaign to deliver that polling, the SNP achieved the predicted 70+ seats and a majority government at the next election. Do we realistically, with the incompetent and inept actions of Boris and his cohort government, expect that support to collapse to less than 2016 support of 46% of the vote?
Well, from everything I've looked at, there are two things that underlie the increase in support for independence, which has been in evidence in the polls basically since the spring of last year. One of the ironies of the 2014 independence referendum, and many of you will remember this, we spent hours arguing about whether or not an independent Scotland could or could not be a continuing member of the European Union. Even President Barroso expressed a view on this subject. It was one of those occasions when the politicians talked endlessly to each other and were actually completely wasting their time. Because one of the ironies of the referendum is that there was no relationship at all between people's views and attitudes towards the European Union and whether they voted yes or no. It has, of course, long been the case, and Keith will know this, that there's been an element of nationalist support that's basically said, what's the point of liberating ourselves from London, only to put ourselves into chains with Brussels. That's what has long been a minority view inside the SNP, but it is also a long established traditional position amongst some people inside the SNP. The 2016 EU referendum, of course, initially was greeted by people inside the nationalist movement as, well, look, this just finally goes to show and will convince people that for so long as Scotland is a part of the United Kingdom, it's always at risk of having its democratic wishes overturned by the views of people in England. Yet in practice, for 2 years, at the aggregate level, the polls did not shift. But what was going on underneath was a fundamental reshaping of the character of support for nationalism in Scotland, and also, by the way, a change in the character of the support for the SNP. That is, that some people, indeed, who had voted no and remain, switched to yes, but they were counterbalanced for a long time by an equal number of people who voted yes and leave. And by the way, if you want to know the principal reason why the SNP lost ground in the 2017 Westminster election, it was not the argument about IndyRef2, it was because the SNP lost ground quite heavily amongst those of its 2015 supporters who had voted leave, and some of them actually switched to the Tories, okay? So the SNP votes now become much more clearly a Remain vote, much more Remain vote than it was before the 2016 referendum. What began to happen last year was that rather than, as it were, this resorting having no net effect, the increase in support for yes amongst Remain voters continued apace, and all of the increase in support for independence that was evident in the polls through to Brexit Day at the beginning of this year occurred as a result of Brexit. So you need, but it does mean that this is a very, that basically, whereas in 2014, the argument about the EU was irrelevant to voters, the argument about the EU is now central to the basis of support for independence and the fact that support has risen. And then beyond that, there is then a second thing which has happened, which is that it looks as though, coronavirus, which is the most important public policy challenge facing the devolved institutions since 1999. Nicola Sturgeon's rating is very high, Boris Johnson's is very low, and it looks as though some people in Scotland have been convinced of the argument that an independent Scotland would have handled coronavirus better, and therefore it provides more effective government. Now, I think the second of those, I think you need to appreciate, is pretty conditional. And if in the next 6 months the Scottish public comes to a different view about how well the two governments are handling coronavirus, you may find that some of that support for independence slips, and indeed some of the support for the SNP slips. But on the other hand, undoubtedly, and I've said this to unionist audiences as well, the problem that the unionist side have is that the pursuit of Brexit has undermined support for the union, and Brexit has happened, it's not going away. And that's the thing that above all has changed the character of support and has changed the distribution of support in a way that is at the moment to your advantage. But just be aware, how much more advantage you're going to get out of that, we'll have to wait and see. And much again will also depend, what are the consequences of Brexit between now and May of next year? If it proves to be a disaster, it will be to your advantage. If it you don't notice, it will begin to die in voters' minds. So there are lots of conditionalities there. What happens to Brexit, what happens to coronavirus are probably essential, and you need to be aware of that. But certainly, I think the fact that Brexit has been pursued has been, in the long run, significantly to the yes side's advantage.
I think John is actually quite correct there in relation to the EU Remainers and Leavers being quite crucial to the change in 2017. And it was mainly coastal constituencies that had historic fishing stuff. And although there's very little fishing now, there's still a community memory of fishing that goes really deep into these communities. And maybe, if John's willing to take a wee question from me, given that we'll be out of Europe at the turn of the year, and it will be a few years if we get our independence negotiations started next year before we can even get back in, EFTA is an option that we could use very, very quickly, which has kind of some of the advantages and some disadvantages. If an independent Scotland were to go into EFTA and then negotiate with the EU for possibly going back, but hold a referendum on it, do you think, John, that the people who want out of Europe would see that as a positive thing and come back to the independence cause on the basis that they could stick with EFTA? Or do you see a disadvantage that strong Remainers would see it having a referendum in future in Scotland about Europe would actually be a bad thing?
Well, you might, but I mean, you just need to be aware that, the thing above all that most Leave voters want, and they're not different in Scotland in that respect, is that they're looking for an end of freedom of movement. And if you're in a Norway type relationship with the European Union, you're still embracing freedom of movement. So you have to worry about that. I guess, Dave, what I would worry about, I think, at the moment, it seems to me that Scotland wishes to remain part of the European Union, and a majority of people would probably vote to go back into the European Union if Scotland were an independent country, except that there is, of course, as yet, very little discussed issue, which you will have to come up with a clear position on, which is, if Scotland is going to rejoin the European Union as an independent country, what happens to the border between Gretna and Berwick? And that will, I think, be one of the more difficult issues for you to handle, because whereas in 2014, basically, Scotland becoming an independent country made no difference at all to the freedom of either movement of persons or of goods between Scotland and England. If Scotland's inside the single market and England and Wales are not, it will make a difference. And how that's going to be, well, we know enough from the position on the island of Ireland is that is a difficult question to answer.
And if I can kind of just say that a couple of quick things on John's points about Yes and leave. And I don't quite agree with Dave that it was only coastal communities. Some very deprived communities in my constituency were where we got the strongest votes. Remember, my patch was the first to declare on the night. It was 54% no, 46% yes. But in some of the most deprived communities, a very strong late vote for yes. Those same communities had quite high votes for leave. And I think it was something to do with very marginalised communities trying to change the system to try and work better to their advantage. However, I do think that, first of all, I agree with John, none of this is set in stone. It can change dramatically, which is why I'm trying to warn about the idea this majority is a tick of box and we're there. It's just simply not the case. But I do think it's a bit more subtle than the Brexit leave or remain. I think it's much more to do with, and I think Brexit is almost as big a thing in this regard as the COVID competence issue. And it's to do with the fact that many people in Scotland that previously voted no are losing faith in the UK's institutions. They see them being trashed, whether it's the Queen, being lied to by Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament, whether it's the triple A-rated currency has gone, the £2 trillion of debt, willingness to break international law. Now, for some of us, it doesn't really matter because we believe in independence anyway. But for many people, some of the touchstones of what they always believed in, this strong, stable beacon of democracy around the world, is being trashed day in, day out. And that's having a very noticeable effect in my experience. And I think the one thing that will not change, or nothing is guaranteed in this, is the incompetence of the UK government. It's got a different feel to any previous UK government. It's this management by chaos, and I think that's going to continue to fall on the wrong side of opinion in Scotland, and crucially on the wrong side of many of those that we've still to convince to move from no to yes. That's perhaps one of the most encouraging signs. But none of this is guaranteed nearly 8 months out from an election.
I'll just throw in a comment there on the borders, which is not Green Party policy, but I thought it was quite interesting. Did people see the video of people, holidaymakers, being turned away at the borders in Wales because of different lockdown regulations? I thought that was a very interesting development. The people in England were being turned away at the border in Wales, and there was no fuss about it. It barely made the news. And yet Wales, for a short time, due to COVID regulations, implemented a hard border. They just did it. I thought that was very interesting. I'm not sure the border issue in practice is such a traumatic thing because Wales did it. But I agree that it can be an emotive thing when people are talking about it.
Yeah. Moving on to the next question. I've got a question here that is actually specifically for you, Lorna. Will the Green Party be standing in any constituency seats? And does the Green Party plan to have list candidates in all constituencies?
So the second question doesn't make sense. We will stand list candidates in every region.
Yes, I assume that's what's meant.
We'll stand in every region, absolutely. We are in fact polling to win MSPs in every region. So everyone in Scotland will be able to have a Green MSP. We're polling to have 2 in Glasgow, 2 in Lothian, 1 everywhere else. Although we're going to push for more than that because we think more greens is better. Obviously, that's what we do. We will stand in some constituencies. We don't know how many yet because of the way the Green Party operates. It's not central. I don't like tell the party what to do. The regional branches, every branch decides for themselves what they're going to do. And we're going to, over the next few months, I'll find out when you do, which branches are going to stand constituency candidates. So yeah, stay tuned to the news and you'll find out when I do.
Thank you. There's a question here, well, given by two different people, Sharon Trish and Alistair MacDonald, really both saying much the same thing. Which is probably one for you, John. Given that the hunt system is imperfect, chosen for us and problematic, what method would you prefer for an independent Scotland?
Well, I have to say that the first thing to say is that, that you first of all have to decide what you want an election to achieve, and then you have an idea of what system is preferred. I am not a particular fan of the additional member system, partly because of some of the tactical difficulties that it gives rise to. I think my view is that if you are in favour of a system of proportional representation, so let me just make that assumption for the moment, then put it like this: you have to come up with some good arguments for either not having single transferable vote, or at least what we can call an open party list system, i.e. a system whereby voters can effect some exercise of choice over individual candidates. It's not that STV is perfect, and the two downsides of it, I mean, we see this particularly in local government elections in Scotland, which is unless the candidates are well known, you can get a relatively high instance of so-called alphabetic voting. So if you're called Alpha, you get elected, and if you're called Zebra, you don't have much chance of being elected. On the other hand, if the candidates are well known, it works. And secondly, the proportionality of the system does get limited by the fact that basically you cannot really have constituencies that elect much more than 5 or 6 MSPs, because then the choice facing voters is too confusing and too great. So those are its two constraints. So I don't say that's what you have to do, but shall we say, you have to come up with something that's better for that, because its great advantage is that it does enable voters both to exercise a choice over candidates as well as preference over parties. But it's not the only way of doing that. There are other ways of coming up with something quite similar to STV.
Thank you, John. Right, I think now we need to move to speakers' closing thoughts on how the meeting's gone and how you feel about it, etc., etc. So could we start perhaps with Dave Thompson?
Well, I think it's been a great meeting, Ruth, and thanks very much for organising it. It's first class. There's been a lot of really good debate. I've enjoyed taking part, and I would just say to everyone, let's max the yes. Let's ensure we don't waste our second votes. Let's make sure we get unionists out of the Scottish Parliament and get independent supporters in there. Whatever happens, that's got to be a good thing. Getting rid of a whole lot of people who sit there constantly complaining all the time about the SNP government. If we could get rid of half of them and fill those seats with people who will look after their local regions, local champions like Margot MacDonald did with Lothian, and with small parties who join us as well. So we'll have ISP MSPs, SSP MSPs, Solidarity MSPs, as well as Green MSPs. And I think the Greens would do better with us rather than against us.
You won't,
so
and no, that's absolutely not going to happen. Definitely not. No chance.
Well, that's your choice, Lorna, if that's what you wish to do.
It's my choice to get 10 Green MSPs. That's what's going to happen. Maybe more. Yeah, that's fine. The way it's going to go.
And I have no problem with that whatsoever, but we will be offering unity and working together to ensure Scotland wins out of this election, not a political party. And that's the difference with us. We only have to be a political party to allow us to stand in the election. We are a true alliance and a uniting force to pull the small parties of Scotland together to maximise the yes vote and get the maximum number of MSPs elected who support independence. We're not interested in particular individual policy issues. The candidates will put their own manifestos to their own regions, and the small parties will do the same, and we'll have a wide range of look at us all sort candidates, so you can pick and mix whatever one suits you policy-wise, and we'll have a true rainbow Scottish Parliament with a wide variety of very interesting people, I think, next May.
Thank you. Just before I move on to one of the other speakers, can I just ask you, David, if the other parties decide that they don't want to come under your umbrella, would you continue?
Well, we are very optimistic that we will have some success there. We're going at this in a very positive way, and I'm pretty sure that we will get small parties joining us. And I think as the polls begin to show that we're doing well, and parties like the Greens realise that on their own they're actually going to drop, because 2%, as Professor Curtice said, vote Green because it's the only sort of credible second list vote at the moment. Once people see we're a credible second list vote, a united alliance of small parties, they'll move from the Greens the Greens will be facing maybe 2 MSPs, not the 10 or 12 that Lorna wishes to get. Whereas if she comes in with us, I'm sure we could negotiate a far better number than that. At least the 6 they've got just now, I would suggest.
Thank you, David. Keith.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for the meeting, for organising it. I'm doing quite a number of these meetings just now, as you can imagine, and it just shows how vibrant the discussion is. What I would say is there are people here with different views certainly in the SNP, different views on the way to achieve independence, which is entirely legitimate. And actually, I have to be honest, a major contrast from the first 30 years I was in the SNP. And when I joined, we were at 11% in the opinion polls, 2 MPs, and if you got somebody saying yes when you canvassed, it was 1 in 50 or so on. So to see so many people so interested and engaged with this issue is really gratifying. One thing I would say is we're not all going to be united. We have different views. We've heard some of the views about a Section 30, different views about different new parties and so on. But I don't think we should be too quick to question each other's commitment to independence just because we see a different way of achieving that. We have to realise, the polls show us as being the majority just now, people that want independence for Scotland. We've never been this close. As I say, back in the mid-80s, early 80s, when I first got involved, 10, 11% support for independence. It's absolutely transformed from that time. So, and I do believe we're extremely close to it as well. So let's not fall out amongst each other. Somebody asked me the question in the chat bar earlier on about my view of the Yes movement. I do many, many meetings with Yes organisations all the time. I'm mentioning Dave's Scottish Independence Convention, Scottish Independence Foundation, Yes Registry, many others. We should keep on talking to each other and give each other the respect that we deserve. If we can unite at this absolutely critical time, this is as close as it's ever been. And if we can keep this together, I believe, it's just my belief, but I believe the best thing we can do is have both votes SNP, a huge vote for the SNP and a very strong representation at Holyrood next year, make it the strongest possible case to prosecute that independence referendum. Getting the referendum is what we've concentrated on. We also have to concentrate on winning it. Many people have asked different aspects of policy. The interesting point is, we can all say we must have this policy or that policy, but there's a great deal of different views about what policy we should have. So that's another question that we have to ask. But let's get the mandate from the Parliament next year, then get the policies and win the arguments to win independence. I believe we're closer than ever, and I'm really grateful to those that have put together the next meeting. And one last point, I think Lindsay Spouge made the point about the demographic profile of certainly the panellists, and perhaps we could do better than that in future, because they made the point that's where we've got extraordinary support amongst our young people for independence and indeed for the SNP. Thank you.
Good point there, Keith. I struggled to get a woman on board, so finding a young one as well was well. I think Lorna's relatively young, so
I'll be 45 in 2 weeks.
Oh well,
All the lie.
But that's young to me. Right, Lorna, would you like to go next?
Sure, I don't have much more to add, but thank you very much for inviting me. It's so exciting to hear so much indie chat. The polls recently have been exciting. It's so exciting to hear. In fact, as Keith points out, it's exciting to hear a broad church of people interested in independence. It shows that it isn't a niche movement. I mean, I obviously live in a green bubble with green people who want independence for green reasons, but it's pretty cool that we all want independence for different reasons. I think that shows how viable and how vibrant the independence movement is. So thanks again for organizing this meeting. Let's keep campaigning. Let's get those poll numbers up to 60%. Let's win the people of Scotland over to our vision of an independent Scotland.
Thank you, Lorna. John, would you like to finish off?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for allowing an interloper to join in your meeting, and I hope I haven't trod too much on your hospitality. I've certainly found it interesting to hear the views. I particularly thought that David provided an eloquent defence of his position. I certainly understand his position much better now than I did from some of the press reports. I would, though, just end with 2 observations. One is that I think one of the advantages that the Yes side in Scotland enjoys is that, for good or ill, most much of its party political support is concentrated in one party, whereas in contrast, the unionist movement is fragmented between the Conservatives, the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. That does put them at a disadvantage because it means that while they can all agree on how they might want to attack the vision of independence, they do struggle to come up with an agreed vision of how they envisage Scotland's continuing future inside the United Kingdom. I think that's one of the reasons why they focused on Project Fear in 2014, but we now know enough to know that simply doing that isn't necessarily adequate. And the truth is, if there is another referendum soon, the Unionists will struggle to come up with an agreed line as to what is the future for Scotland that they are promoting. So that's just one thought to bear in mind. The second thought I would bear in mind is this, is at the end of the day, the aim of the Holyrood electoral system is indeed to deliver a result that's reasonably proportional. Yes, in granting that system, if that's the right word, Westminster arguably was coming up with a system that made it more difficult for the SNP ever to win a parliamentary majority, but equally also in practice it provided the SNP with a lifeline of becoming a full-time parliamentary party for the first time in its existence. And in practice, but therefore do think a little bit about whether or not engaging in activity that some at least may feel is an attempt to game the system is something that will necessarily strengthen the nationalist movement, or whether some people will say, well, actually, this is a movement that seems to be trying to bend the rules of a system that actually, from so far at least, it's profited rather strongly.
Thank you, John. That really kind of concludes our meeting. And finally, this is a blatant advertising plug. For those of you who don't know, Grassroots Oban runs what we call the National Yes Banner Library. Basically, it's if your Yes group would like to get involved, you purchase at cost 5 banners, which you choose to put whereabouts you want in your area, and every couple of months we'll swap them around with other libraries, with other groups across Scotland, so as to keep the message different. If you'd like to join, let us know in the chat, or email us, or have a look on the website, which is grassrootsoban.scot. Okay, and thank you very much to everybody for coming along, and thank you particularly to our 4 speakers. Thank you very, very much.
You've been listening to Indie Live Radio, and that was the Yes Group Spotlight show, in which we highlight an event organised by one of the Yes Groups across Scotland. This week's show was brought to you by Grassroots Oban team, and we just want again to say thanks very much, guys, for letting us broadcast your event. It was a really good discussion and has thrown up a lot of interesting food for thought.